it's funny, isn't it? Like, how much information is out there these days? Just a ridiculous amount.
Mm.
And like you said in our prep call, it can feel like you're just drowning in this sea of like articles and opinions and just,
Data point.
yeah, data points,
Yeah.
headlines. And it's so hard to get a grip on what's really important.
Especially for someone like you who's actively trying to stay informed and engaged.
Right. And that's kind of the whole idea behind this deep dive. It's like we take the stuff that you've flagged, the articles that you've sent, and we try to do the hard work of making sense of it, you know?
Exactly. Cutting through the noise, really getting to the core of what's going on.
Right. And for this one, this deep dive, we're going to be tackling something you sent over about President Trump's use of executive orders, specifically in the first 100 days or so of his second term.
Yeah, you had some really interesting questions about that.
Yeah. And you'd sent over this CBS News report that was breaking it all down.
They did a pretty good job of laying out the numbers and the different categories of orders.
Yeah, and I think it's important for us to be clear right from the start that, like, we're not here to take sides politically on any of these specific orders. We're trying to understand, the nature of these orders, what makes them significant, and how they fit into the whole historical picture.
Exactly. So more about the how and the why rather than the what, if that makes
Yeah,
sense.
absolutely.
So what really jumps out at you from the CBS report is just the sheer number of executive orders. It's kind of mind-blowing.
It is. So CBS reports that President Trump has signed 104 executive orders in his first 100 days.
104.
104. That's
It,
a record.
it is. The previous record was held by Franklin D. Roosevelt,
Oh, wow.
who signed 99 executive orders in his first 100 days.
FDR. I mean, talk about historical context, right? Like,
Yeah.
we all know FDR's first 100 days, it was the Great Depression. The country was in a full-blown crisis. It was a national emergency.
Right. So for President Trump to surpass that number now, well, it's what CBS News calls an unprecedented pace.
Unprecedented, yeah. And for you, listening to this, I mean, think about it. This isn't just some random statistic. This could be a real shift in how the executive branch wants to operate. Like maybe trying to bypass the whole legislative process.
Right. And maybe it's about how the executive branch views its power in relation to the other branches.
Yeah. So to really understand this, we need to look at, like, what are these executive orders actually about? CBS News helpfully breaks them down into different categories. So what did you find?
Well, it looks like the biggest single category, just looking at the numbers here, is all about shrinking the size of the federal government, like making it smaller, more efficient.
Yeah, okay. So like budget cuts and stuff.
Yeah, potentially. But also things like restructuring departments.
Mm.
CBS mentioned 17 executive orders falling under this category.
17.
17.
That's a lot.
It is. And they specifically highlight this new Department of Government Efficiency, which, by the way, is being led by Elon Musk, which is kind of interesting in itself.
Oh, wow. I did not know that. That's fascinating. So 17 orders, all focused on making the government leaner and meaner.
Yeah. I think it's worth mentioning here, just so we're clear for you listening, you know what an executive order actually is. It's basically a directive from the president. And it has the force of law, but it doesn't need approval from Congress.
Right.
But there are limitations. It has to fall under the president's constitutional authority. And like we'll see later with the judicial challenges, there's always debate about exactly where those lines are.
Right. So like even though these executive orders can be pretty powerful, they're not a blank check for the president to do whatever they want.
Exactly.
Okay, so 17 on shrinking the government. What's next?
Okay, so another big one is trade policy. There are 16 executive orders focused on this.
16. Okay, so
Sure.
almost as many as the government shrinking ones. What's the focus there?
And a lot of it has to do with tariffs.
Tariffs. Okay, so like those taxes on goods coming into the country.
Yeah. And from what CBS says, President Trump's argument is that these tariffs are needed to protect American businesses.
Okay, so it's kind of that America First idea, trying to boost domestic industries.
Exactly. But the report also points out that there are economists who are warning that these tariffs could actually end up hurting consumers by raising prices.
Right, because if it costs more to import things, those costs are probably going to get passed on to the people who buy them.
Exactly. It's this classic trade-off, potentially helping some businesses, but potentially hurting consumers.
Okay, makes sense.
And then, moving on, there's a whole bunch of orders dealing with fossil fuels. Specifically, there are a number of orders aimed at deregulating the industry, like rolling back some of the environmental rules that were put in place by the previous administration.
Yeah, okay. And CBS specifically mentions the rolling back of limits on tailpipe emissions.
Right. They
Mm.
highlight that as a key example. So that's a pretty big shift in policy.
Yeah, for sure. So we've got shrinking the government, trade, fossil fuels. What else is on the list?
Well, immigration is another big one. Although CBS doesn't give an exact number in this section of the report, they do mention a directive to send U.S. military troops to the southern border.
Wow. So it's clear that reducing immigration is a priority for the administration.
Yeah. And then there's this really interesting category of orders that are about targeting individuals.
Interesting individual.
Yeah, like CBS says there are 5 orders that have either revoked security clearances or canceled government contracts.
Really?
Yeah. And these were for people who were either involved in investigations related to President Trump or who were publicly critical of him.
Wow. So this is different, right? It's not about like a broad policy area like trade or the environment. It's about specific people.
Exactly. And I think it raises some interesting questions about the use of presidential power. You know,
Yeah. Like, is it appropriate for a president to use executive orders in this way?
it definitely makes you wonder.
Yeah, for sure.
And then there are these 3 executive orders that are about reversing some of President Biden's policies, specifically on things like COVID-19 and climate change.
Okay. So basically just undoing what the previous administration did.
Yeah, and CBS points out that this is pretty common when a new president comes in,
Mm-hmm.
especially if those policies weren't actually passed into law by Congress.
Right. Because if it's just an executive order, the next president can just come in and reverse it with another executive order.
Exactly. It shows you how temporary these things can be.
But then it also raises the question, like, is this just a bunch of back and forth? You know, one president does one thing, the next president undoes it, and nothing really changes in the long run.
That's a really good question and something to think about.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got a sense of the sheer number of these executive orders and the areas they cover. But CBS also talks about the pushback that these orders are getting, like from the courts.
Right, and this is really important because it highlights the fact that executive orders aren't absolute. There are checks and balances in the system.
Yeah, and specifically, CBS mentions that some of these orders have already been put on hold by judges, like the one trying to end birthright citizenship.
And the one freezing foreign aid by shutting down USAI.
Right. And the judges are basically saying, hold on, we're not sure if you actually have the power to do this.
Exactly. It's a question of executive overreach.
Right. And for you listening, this is a perfect example of how the different branches of government are supposed to interact. Like, the judiciary is there to make sure that the president doesn't exceed their authority.
Right. And CBS quotes this guy, William Howell, a professor at Johns Hopkins University. And he says that the sheer volume of judicial reversals this early in the term is exceptional. Like, it's not normal to see this many orders being blocked by the court so quickly.
Yeah. And for you, this raises some big questions, right? Like, what does it mean for these policies if they keep getting tied up in court? Will they actually be able to be implemented?
Right. And it also makes you think about the bigger picture. Like, what does this say about the balance of power between the different branches of government?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So we've talked about the nature of these orders and the pushback they're getting. Now let's sit back and look at the historical context.
Right. Because that can tell us a lot about what makes this moment so unusual.
Exactly. And CBS actually reminds us that during his 2016 campaign, President Trump was actually critical of President Obama's use of executive orders.
He was?
Yeah. He said he preferred to work with Congress to get things done.
Huh. That's interesting.
Right. It kind of makes you wonder what's changed.
Well, it could be a lot of things. Maybe it's a different strategy. Maybe he's realized how hard it is to work with Congress, especially when it's divided.
Yeah. Or maybe it's just that being president is a lot different than running for president.
Could be. And it's worth noting that at this point in their presidencies, at least 14 other presidents had signed fewer than 40 executive orders.
40. Wow. Okay, so President Trump is really breaking the mold here.
He is. And even President Biden, who had the second highest number after FDR, he only signed 37 in his first 100 days.
37. So we're talking about more than double that.
Yeah, it's a significant difference.
And it's really interesting to compare President Trump's actions to FDR's.
Right. Because while they both signed a lot of executive orders in their first 100 days, the context was really different.
Yeah. For FDR, it was about responding to a massive national crisis. And a lot of those executive orders were actually part of a bigger legislative agenda that he was pushing through Congress.
Right. But for President Trump, it seems like more of a go-it-alone approach.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of these orders are in areas where there's a lot of controversy and division in the country.
Yeah. And CBS even includes this quote from FDR where he's talking about the crowding events of the 100 days, and how he needs a little quiet thought to process everything that's happened.
Makes you think, right? Like, are things moving too fast now? Is there enough time for reflection and consideration of the long-term consequences?
Yeah, it's a good point. And then Professor Howell in the CBS report, he makes this really interesting observation about how presidents have historically responded to checks and balances, specifically when the courts have ruled against them.
Okay, I'm interested to hear this.
So he says that in the past, presidents have generally accepted judicial rulings, even if they didn't agree with them. He gives the example of President Truman trying to take control of the steel mills during a strike.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading about that.
Right, and the Supreme Court ultimately ruled that he didn't have the authority to do that.
Right.
And Howell emphasizes that Truman, while he really defended his actions, he ultimately respected the court's decision.
So he abided by the ruling.
Exactly. And Howell says that this is a key difference with President Trump's reaction to his executive orders being blocked.
Oh, how so?
Well, according to the report, President Trump has actually suggested impeaching the judges who ruled against him. Yeah. And Howell even says, quote, "We didn't hear Truman call for impeachment of the judges, which is what we're now hearing from Trump when he loses in the federal judiciary."
That's a pretty stark contrast.
Yeah, it is. And for you listening, I think this is a really important point to consider because it might signal a shift in how the executive branch views the role of the judiciary.
Right. Like, is there the same level of respect for the judicial process?
Exactly. And it raises all these questions about the balance of power and the future of our system of government.
For sure.
Okay, so to wrap things up, what are the key takeaways here for you?
Well, first off, the sheer number of executive orders is off the charts. 104 in the first 100 days. That's a record.
A record that even beats FDR's. And these orders, they're not just randomly scattered. They're focused on some key areas like shrinking the government, trade, fossil fuels, immigration.
Right. And we've also seen orders targeting specific individuals and orders that are specifically designed to reverse policies from the previous administration.
And a lot of these orders are facing legal challenges, which, according to Professor Howell, is pretty unusual this early in a term.
And then there's that whole historical comparison, which shows that President Trump's approach to executive orders and his response to judicial rulings might be different from what we've seen in the past.
Yeah, for sure. And we really hope that this deep dive has given you a better understanding of this whole issue. Like we said at the beginning, we're not here to take sides on the policies themselves. We're just trying to provide some context and help you make sense of this complex situation.
Right. And we're using the information you shared with us. That CBS report was really helpful.
Absolutely. Okay, so here's a final thought for you to chew on. Given everything we've talked about, what do you think this reliance on executive orders and the pushback from the courts tells us about the relationship between the executive and judicial branches? And how might this impact the country in the long run, regardless of your opinion on these specific policies? It's something to really ponder as we move forward.
It's going to be interesting to see how this all plays out.
Yeah, for sure.